Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. Back when I was working patrol, welfare checks were the calls I quietly hated the most. They seemed simple on paper. Someone hasn't heard from a relative, usually an older person, sometimes a person living alone, and they just want us to check. But more often than not, behind that door is something that stays with you. Not in the way a shooting or a fight does, but in a slower, quieter way. That afternoon was cold. One of those dull, gray days where the sky looks like wet concrete and everything feels heavier. My partner and I got the call for an elderly man whose family lived out of state. They hadn't heard from him in a while. No one had. They'd tried calling, texting, emailing, nothing. No answer. The family gave us authorization to enter if there was no response. That's pretty standard. But it's also the moment where the pit in your stomach grows because it usually means you won't find someone who just went out for groceries. We pulled up to the house around 2:40 p.m. It was in an older neighborhood, the kind with narrow driveways and overgrown bushes. The lawn hadn't been cut in a long time. The mailbox was stuffed with letters and ads, enough to spill out. A faded garden gnome leaned sideways in the dirt near the front steps. You can tell a lot from the outside of a house. This one said no one had cared for it in weeks. We knocked on the front door first. Hard knocks. We waited. Silence. We knocked again. Nothing. There were no sounds from inside, no shuffling, no TV, no faint movement. Tried the doorknob. Locked. We walked around to the side where the garage door was. It was one of those old metal roll-up doors with peeling paint and rusted edges. There was a keypad, but it didn't work. The family had given dispatch the code, but after we punched it in a few times and nothing happened, we just went to the small side door. It wasn't fully latched. My partner gave it a push and it creaked open. The smell hit before the door was even open halfway. That thick, wet, sour smell. If you've ever smelled a decomposing body, you never forget it. It seeps into your clothes and stays in your memory. But even before the body, the garage itself told us enough. It was packed with junk from floor to ceiling. Old cardboard boxes caved in on themselves. Yellowed newspapers stacked shoulder high. Rusted bikes leaning against walls. Broken fans. Piles of tools, dirty clothes, old food containers. It wasn't a regular garage. It was a hoarder's garage. There was a narrow path about a foot wide cutting through the clutter, leading toward the door into the house. I took slow steps. Every time I moved, the floor crunched with something. Old wrappers, broken glass, dirt. The air inside felt thick. My radio pressed against my vest as I squeezed past stacks of old furniture. Felt like the walls were closing in, even though I knew it was just junk stacked too high. The smell grew stronger the closer we got to the door to the kitchen. It wasn't the faint odor of a dead animal. It was deep and sour and human. Once you smell human decomposition, it's different. It's heavier, settles in your nose. We opened the interior door slowly. Inside, the kitchen was worse than the garage. Every counter was covered in old dishes, some with mold grown thick like a white crust. The sink was piled high with plates and black water. A refrigerator hummed softly, but smelled like something inside had died a long time ago. The trash pathways in the kitchen were narrow, and there were empty cat food cans scattered across the floor. No movement, no sound. My partner moved behind me as I stepped forward. The living room looked almost the same. A chair buried under stacks of magazines. Curtains drawn shut. The carpet beneath our boots made a soft, sticky sound. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing disturbed. Just quiet, stale air and that smell getting heavier by the second. We made our way down the hallway. Family photos on the walls were crooked and faded. Some frames cracked. At the end of the hallway was the master bedroom. I already knew that was where we'd find him. You can almost feel where a body is in a house like this. The smell seeps from that direction, and it gets more distinct the closer you get. When I stepped into the bedroom doorway, the first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No breeze, no movement. just the steady hum of the fridge somewhere far away. The man was sitting in a wooden rocking chair near the window. The curtains were half shut, and the late afternoon light came through in dusty streaks. His body was leaned over sharply to the right, at an almost perfect 90-degree angle. At first glance, it didn't even look real. His torso was collapsed sideways, his arms hanging loosely, his head slumped, chin touching his chest. The position looked wrong, like a doll that had been bent and left there, but there were no signs of a struggle, no trauma. Just gravity and time. Post-mortem, when the muscles break down and the body loses all tension, it folds. His spine had given way, snapped under its own weight. The smell in that room was almost unbearable. It clung to the back of my throat and burned my eyes. His clothes were loose, wrinkled, faded blue pajama pants and a flannel shirt. His skin had already darkened and pulled tight in some places, bloated in others. Flies gathered around his face and hands. The floor beneath the chair showed signs of fluid seepage, a dark stain spreading outward. I checked for anything out of place. Windows locked, no overturned furniture, no bruising or wounds on the visible parts of his body. His wallet sat on the small side table next to a cold cup of coffee with a film grown over it. A calendar on the wall was still flipped to 3 weeks ago. That was probably the last time anyone had seen him alive. We backed out slowly, careful not to disturb anything. It wasn't a crime scene, not in the traditional sense, but every welfare check like this has to be handled carefully. We radioed it in, confirmed we had a deceased male, and requested the coroner. The house felt even quieter once the adrenaline started to fade. Standing in that hallway, with the smell and the stillness, it felt like stepping out of time. He'd been sitting in that chair for days, maybe weeks, while the world outside kept moving. Mail kept piling up, the grass kept growing, the calendar stayed frozen. We opened a few windows near the kitchen to air out the smell, but it barely made a difference. The neighbors had probably smelled it long before today. I noticed a small photo on the wall near the hallway. It showed him standing with a woman, probably his wife, in front of the same house. The yard was bright, freshly cut, everything looked alive. Time has a way of changing everything slowly, then all at once. The coroner arrived, then the medical examiner. We walked them through what we'd seen, step by step. They brought in their equipment, did their work with quiet precision. We stood outside near the patrol car while they moved the body out. The cool air outside felt almost too clean after being inside. I looked back at the house while they zipped him into the black bag. It wasn't a violent end, just a lonely one. And that can be worse in its own way. The rocking chair was still there in my head. That bent shape, that sharp angle. Not because of anything supernatural. Not because of a ghost or a shadow in the corner. Just because of how fragile people really are when no one's watching. We cleared the scene after the coroner took him. We locked the garage door, secured the property, and left our report with dispatch. Driving away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Just another old home on a quiet street. But the image didn't leave. It never really does. That call wasn't my first body, and it wasn't my last. But it was one of those that stayed sharp in my memory. Not because of what happened, but because of how ordinary it all was. An old man passed away alone in his chair, surrounded by the clutter of his life, and no one knew until we knocked on the door. Some calls stay with you not because they scare you in the moment, but because of how quiet they are when everything is over. I still remember the night my dad told me that story like it happened yesterday. It wasn't the kind of story you forget. He had been a road officer for years, the kind of man who didn't scare easily. He had worked late nights, pulled people out of wrecks, chased stolen cars, dealt with fights, and seen things most people never do. But what happened that night stuck with him. I could see it in the way he talked about it. His voice didn't shake, but there was something heavy in it. It was the kind of weight that doesn't go away, even when the scars fade. It was just after midnight. My dad was out on patrol, driving the long stretch of highway outside of town. It was the quiet part of the shift when most people were home, and the world seemed almost too still. The kind of stillness that makes every little sound stand out. His windows were rolled up, the radio low, engine humming steady. He'd been running radar for speeders, watching the empty road in front of him, headlights cutting through the dark. That stretch of road had no streetlights, just pitch-black fields on both sides, with the highway running straight down the middle like a dark ribbon. The only light came from his headlights and the soft glow from the dashboard. He always said night patrols like that felt different. You're more alert, more aware of everything around you. Every set of headlights in the distance matters. Every sound behind you matters. He told me he heard it before he saw it. An engine, revving. It wasn't subtle either. It wasn't the sound of someone just driving normally. It was aggressive, loud, and closing in fast. He glanced at his mirror and there it was, a pickup truck flying down the road behind him. Its headlights looked too close, moving too fast. He thought maybe it was just some drunk driver not paying attention, or someone who didn't see him in time. He tightened his grip on the wheel. The truck slammed into the back of his patrol car. The impact was sudden, hard, and violent. His body snapped forward, the seatbelt catching him hard across the chest. The car lurched and shook. For a split second, he thought maybe it really had been an accident. People crash into cops sometimes. But then, before he could even fully process it, the truck backed up. He could see the headlights move back in his rearview mirror. Then the engine roared again. The truck hit him a second time, harder. He said that was the moment everything clicked in his head. It wasn't an accident. This guy was doing it on purpose. He reached for his radio, calling it in. His voice stayed calm because that's what years of training does. But inside, his heart was hammering against his chest. He reported the crash, gave his location, asked for backup. The driver of the truck didn't stick around. He reversed fast, angled the truck and tried to swing past him like he was going to take off down the road. But my dad wasn't about to let someone who rammed a police car just disappear into the night. He turned the wheel and hit the gas, slamming the front end of his patrol car into the truck as it went by. The sound was metal on metal, loud and ugly. The force of the collision jolted him all over again. His head hit the headrest. His ears rang. The truck jerked sideways and stopped. Steam started to hiss up from under the hood. My dad must have hit something good because the engine cut out, and the truck wouldn't move anymore. It just sat there, idling weakly, shuddering in the dark. He tried to get out of the patrol car, but the pain in his leg was like fire. It wasn't just pain. It was the kind that goes deep, the kind that makes your body lock up. When he tried to move it, nothing happened. His leg didn't respond. He looked down, heart pounding, and realized he couldn't feel anything below his knee. For a split second, he panicked. He was trained to stay calm, but this was different. This wasn't a suspect in a parking lot or a chase ending in cuffs. This was him sitting there, alone in the middle of a dark road, with someone who had already shown they were willing to hurt him. He forced himself to breathe, grabbed his gun and pointed it toward the truck. He could see the driver through the windshield. The guy wasn't running. He wasn't even trying to climb out. He was just sitting there, staring ahead with a look my dad said he'll never forget. The kind of look that tells you this isn't a normal drunk or some random idiot. This was someone who had made up their mind about something dark. The guy started slamming his own head with his hands, over and over. Blood started to run down his face, catching the light from the headlights. He was shouting, but the windows muffled the sound. My dad couldn't hear every word, but he could read his lips. He was saying he wanted to die, that he was going to kill him, over and over. My dad couldn't move his leg, couldn't chase if the guy ran, couldn't run if something went wrong. All he could do was keep that gun steady and keep his eyes locked on the driver. Every second stretched out. It felt longer than it was. He kept checking his radio, waiting for sirens, waiting for backup to show up on that empty stretch of road. The truck door never opened, but the guy kept thrashing inside, like a caged animal. My dad kept his voice steady, telling him to keep his hands visible. Though he said later that the guy wasn't even really listening. His hands kept going up and down, hitting himself, smearing blood across his face. The smell of leaking coolant and hot oil filled the air. His car was tilted slightly from the hit, the engine still running. His leg was throbbing now, a numb kind of pain that made it hard to focus. He knew if the guy stepped out with a weapon, he'd have to act fast, even with one leg that wouldn't move. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound of sirens broke the silence. Red and blue lights washed over the road, flashing against the truck and the empty fields around them. Other units arrived fast. Officers moved in from the sides, guns drawn, voices cutting through the night. The guy still didn't get out until they dragged him from the truck. They cuffed him on the pavement. My dad said even then, the guy had this wild look in his eyes. No fear, no hesitation, just this blank, angry determination. An ambulance pulled up not long after. They put my dad on a stretcher, and that's when it really hit him. Lying there, legs strapped down, feeling nothing below the knee. The fear wasn't about the guy anymore. It was about what came next. What if he never walked right again? What if his career was over? He was taken to the hospital. I got there as fast as I could, and seeing him on that bed, pale and tired, scared me more than I'll ever admit to him. This was a man I'd seen walk through fire for years, someone I thought was untouchable, and now he was lying there, not sure if he'd ever get up the same way again. In the end, he was lucky. The doctors said there was no permanent nerve damage, just swelling, bruising, and a lot of pain. He went through physical therapy for months, limping through it until he got most of the feeling back. He walks fine now, but he still remembers that night like a scar under the surface. They interviewed the driver later. Turns out it wasn't random. The guy wanted to die. He admitted he wanted a death by cop. He said he didn't regret it. He even said he hoped the crash would kill my dad, so it would make the other officers angrier when they showed up. It wasn't about running. It was about provoking a war he could never win. When my dad told me that, it made me realize how close it had been. If the truck had hit him just a little harder, if the angle had been different, if backup had taken a few minutes longer, the story could have ended in a way I don't want to think about. The road looks the same now, just another dark stretch of highway. But for him, that piece of road isn't just asphalt. It's the place where he almost lost everything. It's the place where he sat with a dead leg and a loaded gun, waiting for someone who didn't care if they lived or died. He still drives that highway sometimes. He says he doesn't think about it as much anymore, but I can see it in the way he checks his mirrors a little more carefully, in the way his hand lingers near the radio a second longer, in the way he pays attention to every engine that comes up behind him. That night didn't end with sirens and glory. It ended with pain, fear, and a reminder of how thin the line really is between ordinary and something you never forget. And even though he recovered, that line is still there, burned into the pavement, into his memory, and into ours. I was on another late-night ride along with my brother, who was a deputy in Amherst, Colorado. I worked as an EMT for a few small towns around northeast Colorado, and when calls weren't coming in, it was common for me to tag along with him. The roads were quiet, the air crisp, and the town itself seemed almost frozen at that hour. Amherst was small, smaller than most people could picture without driving through it. There was a single church at the center, a handful of houses scattered along the dirt roads, a grain tower that loomed in the distance, and a small park just off the main road. About 50 people called the town home. Driving through it at night felt like moving through a place untouched by the outside world, except for the occasional flicker of a porch light or the sound of a dog barking somewhere. Down the street, it was around 3 in the morning when we decided to make our last sweep of the town before calling it a night. We had been driving slowly, lights off, checking streets and making sure nothing looked out of place. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional creak of our vehicle on the gravel road, or the soft rustle of wind through the sparse trees. As we approached the park, something caught my eye in the darkness, a subtle movement that didn't belong. The trees and the swings cast long, distorted shadows in the weak moonlight, but this movement was too deliberate, too human. We slowed down and stopped alongside the dirt road. My brother clicked on the spotlight mounted on the front of the patrol car and began to sweep it across the park. The light cut through the darkness in a harsh beam, illuminating the playground equipment in stark contrast to the black night. For a moment, nothing stirred. Then the beam landed on the back of a young girl, maybe 13, sitting alone on one of the swings. Her back was to us and she didn't move. Her head was tilted slightly downward, and her small hands rested limply on the swing chains. She didn't even seem to notice the light moving over her, like she was frozen in some private moment. The sight immediately gave me chills. Even in a town this small, seeing someone this young out in the park at 3 in the morning didn't make sense. I glanced at my brother, and we both made that silent, uneasy look that only comes when you realize something is off. It wasn't anger or fear exactly. It was that creeping sense of wrongness that makes the hairs on your neck rise. I suggested that we should call her over with the PA system, just to make sure she was okay. My brother nodded silently, reaching for the mic and pressing it down. When we looked back at the swing after the brief pause, she was gone. Not partially gone, not hiding behind the slide or the jungle gym. Completely gone. The park was wide open, nothing around her. Nothing in the shadows for her to duck behind. She had been there just seconds ago. I felt my stomach tighten, my pulse quickening. The thought of someone vanishing like that in broad daylight or moonlight was unnatural. I suggested maybe we should get out and search for her, think maybe she ran behind something or ducked into a corner. But my brother gave me that flat, deadpan look that said he wasn't even considering it. Hell to the no. He started the vehicle and slowly drove away, leaving the park behind us. As we moved down the dirt road, the darkness seemed to press in around us, the only sounds now being the soft crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional distant call of an owl. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing there again. But the park remained empty, silent and utterly still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong about the way she sat there. The way she had ignored the light, the way she had vanished. It felt too deliberate, too impossible. We drove back through the town, past the church, past the scattered houses, past the grain tower that cut a sharp silhouette against the night sky. Everything looked normal, perfectly calm, but the memory of that swing and the girl's stillness haunted me. We made a stop near the edge of town, where the road opened up toward the farmlands. The horizon stretched endlessly, dotted with the occasional fence post or windmill. The silence was almost suffocating. We sat in the car for a moment, lights off, just listening to the wind and the faint hum of the patrol car engine. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that could explain what had just happened. There were no sounds of running feet, no noises that would suggest someone had ducked into the grass, no shadows moving with the wind, just empty darkness. I kept thinking about the girl's posture, the way she hadn't reacted to the spotlight at all. In my experience with EMS calls and late-night runs, kids often respond immediately to any sign of authority or light. They run, they shout, they hide. But she had done none of that. She had simply vanished. The more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. My brother, experienced as he was, didn't comment either. He just drove us back to the station slowly, keeping the car on the road and his eyes scanning the surroundings, though nothing appeared out of place. By the time we returned to the station, the first hints of dawn were brushing the horizon with pale light. The roads were quiet, and the town seemed to slowly wake from its slumber. Amherst had returned to its normal rhythm, but the memory of the swing, the girl, and the empty park lingered like a shadow in my mind. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about calling the local families, the school, maybe even the sheriff, but everything about it made me pause. If it had been a runaway or a lost child, someone would have noticed by morning. Yet no one had reported anything. Nothing. Weeks later, I learned that no one had been missing that night. No children had wandered off, and no incidents had been reported in the park. Everything about it was official, documented, normal, but I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't fatigue. It was real. And that was what made it so unsettling. The impossible had happened in a completely real, completely ordinary place. The memory of the swing, of the girl's back facing us, of her disappearing as if she had never been there, stayed with me. Even now, years later, I think about Amherst at 3 in the morning. The quiet streets, the dark park, and the empty swing. I never saw her again, never found an explanation. And in a town as small as Amherst, if someone vanished without a trace, there should have been chaos. But there wasn't. There was only that brief, unreal moment of seeing something I couldn't explain, something that didn't fit into any kind of logical pattern. My brother still refuses to talk about it, and I've long since stopped suggesting it. We both know what happened, even if we can't say it out loud. That night taught me something about small towns, about quiet roads, and about the unpredictability of the world even in the most ordinary settings. Even when everything seems calm, even when the streets are empty and the houses are dark, there are moments where reality doesn't make sense, where your senses tell you one thing and logic another. Amherst seemed safe, normal, and utterly predictable. But that night it wasn't. And for me, that memory is a reminder that some things don't need a story to be frightening. They only need to happen, and we carry them with us silently, for the rest of our lives. Even after all these years, when I pass the park on a late-night drive, I slow down, keep my eyes on the swing, and check the shadows. Sometimes I swear I see a flicker of movement, a small figure sitting there, still facing away, still impossible. It's enough to make me grip the steering wheel a little tighter, my pulse pick up, and remind me that even the most ordinary places can hold moments that defy understanding. That night in Amherst wasn't just creepy. It was a reminder that reality can be stranger than anything else, and that sometimes what you see can never be explained, and the memory alone is enough to haunt you. The park remains empty now, just a swing set under the stars, yet I will never forget it. I will never forget the way she sat, or the way she disappeared, and the feeling that for just a brief, impossible moment, I had witnessed something completely real and completely unexplainable. It was just after 1 in the morning when my dad got the call. A homeowner had reported a suspicious person on their property, out in a secluded area deep in the woods. The roads leading there were narrow, winding, and almost completely dark. The kind of place where a single set of headlights in the distance can feel both comforting and threatening at the same time. He had been on the force for a long time, and he always told me that these rural calls were some of the hardest because help was far away, and the unknown always felt larger in the middle of nowhere. By the time he arrived, the trees around the property cast long shadows across the driveway, and the old house stood like a dark silhouette against the faint starlight. It was 3 stories tall, with peeling paint and siding that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The strangest part of the house was the sheer number of windows, hundreds of them, and most of them were dusty or broken, but somehow they reflected light in a way that made it impossible to see inside clearly. The house looked abandoned at first glance, but something about it didn't sit right. There was an energy, a sense that someone could be watching from behind those panes of glass. My dad got out of his car, his flashlight cutting a thin beam through the night. He had his hand near his radio, the way officers always do when entering unknown situations. The yard was overgrown, weeds taller than a grown man making every step a challenge. Every snap of a twig under his boots echoed like a gunshot in the quiet. The wind rustled the trees, and the moonlight barely touched the house, leaving it mostly in shadows. As he approached the house, the sudden sound of a deep voice stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't just a shout or someone yelling from a distance. It was a low, commanding voice that carried across the yard. "Take one more step and I'll blow your head off." His hand froze on the flashlight, every muscle tightening instinctively. He could see nothing beyond the reflection of the light bouncing off the windows. It was almost blinding in a way that made the darkness behind them even more impenetrable. Another voice followed quickly, ordering him to put his hands up and keep the light down. Even as he did exactly that, hands raised and slowly lowering his flashlight, his other hand managed to hit the emergency button on his radio. His reputation in the department had always been that of someone who could handle things alone, someone who didn't call for backup unless absolutely necessary. That night, though, almost instinctively, he triggered the panic button. Almost immediately, multiple units started converging on the location. Knowing that if he was calling, the situation must be serious, he stood there for what felt like an eternity. Though he later estimated it to be about 10 minutes, time in that moment slowed. Every sense was heightened. He could hear the wind in the trees, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, even the faint creak of the old house settling on its foundations. The voices didn't speak again, but they seemed to hang in the air, a reminder of the threat that might come at any second. He trained his flashlight on the house whenever he could, trying to catch a glimpse of movement, a shadow, anything that would tell him where the person was hiding. The reflections in the windows made it impossible. Each angle created illusions, making it look like figures moved when there was nothing at all. When the first backup officers arrived, they carefully spread out around the property. The lights from their vehicles cut through the darkness, revealing more of the overgrown yard and the crumbling structure. They went door to door, checking every possible entry. My dad stayed in place, his heart still racing, still trying to process how quickly a routine call could become so dangerous. The officers called over the radio to him repeatedly, making sure he was okay, giving him updates on their positions, but the tension didn't let up. The team worked systematically, beginning with the main entrances and moving to the sides of the house. All the doors were locked. Windows were checked where possible, but the reflections still made visibility difficult. They even moved around the perimeter, tapping on the walls to hear if anyone responded, or if there were signs of movement inside. Nothing. No footprints in the yard beyond the ones my dad had made. No sign of forced entry, no sounds of hiding. The house was locked up tight, and yet the voices had been real. The officers were thorough. They didn't leave a single corner unchecked. Eventually, after an hour of careful searching, they confirmed there was no one inside. No evidence of anyone having been there recently. The air was still. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the distant hum of the patrol vehicles. My dad took a deep breath and tried to calm the adrenaline in his system. Even after all the checks, the feeling that someone had been there didn't completely fade. The experience was one of those moments that leaves a mark, a reminder that the world can be unpredictable and that danger doesn't always announce itself clearly. He later told me that the scariest part wasn't the voices or the threat of a gun. It was the uncertainty. Standing in the dark, hearing those words, seeing the reflections in the windows, knowing that the next moment could have been the last. There's a clarity that comes in situations like that, a focus that forces you to think, to act, to rely on training and instinct at the same time. Every step, every decision mattered because there was no room for mistakes. The incident was eventually documented, and the property owner confirmed no one had been living there or seen anyone on the property. My dad never found out who or what had been on the other side of the windows that night. The calls for suspicious activity out in remote areas are often difficult to verify, and this one was particularly baffling. He admitted later that he didn't sleep well for a few nights afterward. The sound of a voice in the dark, commanding and threatening, stays with a person. Despite the fear, my dad said there was also a strange relief. Backup had arrived. The property was secure and no one was harmed. It reinforced the importance of patience and caution, even for someone experienced. He had made it through the situation and that mattered. He also said it taught him a respect for the unknown, for the way the mind can fill in details when visibility is limited, and for the real dangers that can exist in silence. Looking back, he said that moment in the dark, alone in front of that old house, stayed with him because it was a pure test of instinct and courage. The clarity at the end wasn't just that the house was empty, but that he had survived it, relied on his training, and handled a situation that could have ended badly. It wasn't a ghost story or something fantastical. It was real, raw, and frightening, and it ended with him safe and alive. That sense of relief, that he had navigated a dangerous, unpredictable moment and came out whole, was the ending. The property remained empty. The calls were logged and he drove back home, the dark woods behind him feeling a quiet exhaustion mixed with a strange pride. Even now, years later, he still says it's the memory that creeps up most when he thinks about the unpredictability of the night and the way the human mind reacts when faced with real danger. I remember my dad telling me this story one evening, and even though he wasn't the kind of guy to get spooked easily, the way he told it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He never claimed to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. He's always been level-headed, practical, the kind of person who solves problems with logic and a flashlight. But this night back in the early 80s, something happened that shook him enough to make him quit a job he otherwise liked. Back then, before he joined the state police, he worked as a night security guard at a large factory on the outskirts of town. It was one of those massive, long factories, the kind that you could lose yourself in if you didn't know it well. His shift was alone. Nobody else worked nights except for him. They had a small office tucked into one corner where he could sit, watch TV, listen to the radio, read, or just relax when he wasn't patrolling. The rest of the factory was dark, except for the emergency lights near the exits. The hallways were long, rows of machines lined up in neat industrial patterns, and shadows clung to every corner. His job was straightforward. Every hour, he'd get up from his office, grab his flashlight, and walk the factory floor. He'd go row by row, peeking around machines, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was locked down and secure. Most of the time, it was uneventful. Just him, the hum of the machines left on standby, the faint smell of oil and metal, and the echoes of his own footsteps on the concrete floor. One night, everything changed. He got up for his usual patrol. The office was dark except for the dim glow of the TV, which he had turned down low. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the main hall. At first, nothing seemed off. The rows were empty, silent except for the faint buzz of electricity and the hum of the emergency lights. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed something. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you feel more than see. A movement out of the corner of your eye, a shadow that didn't belong. He froze for a moment. He knew the factory like the back of his hand, and something about that dark stretch in the main hall seemed wrong. There was a darker patch, almost like a shape moving, but when he focused his flashlight on it, it disappeared. He slowly swiped the light back and forth. Nothing. Just the empty rows of machines, neat and orderly. He told himself he was imagining it. Probably just a trick of the dim lights combined with the late hour and his own tired eyes. Trying to shake off the feeling, he continued down the row. His footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. Everything seemed normal, except the tension in his chest and the tightness in his stomach. The factory always felt big at night, but tonight it felt unusually big, as if the shadows were waiting for something. He moved carefully, checking every row, shining his light on the floors, the machines, and the walls. Nothing, not a sound, not a movement, just the low hum of electricity and his own breathing. At the end of the rows was a large open area, the entrance hall. Normally a bright light hung above the main door, making the area easy to see. But tonight it was dim, almost imperceptibly dim. That small difference, the dim light in a place that was usually brightly lit, set his nerves on edge. He stopped for a moment, shining his flashlight across the hall, trying to convince himself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe a bulb was dying. Maybe the wiring had a fault. But even the thought didn't settle him. He could feel the sweat starting to gather on his forehead, and his hands were beginning to feel clammy. He decided not to investigate further. Instead, he turned back toward the main row, telling himself he would finish his patrol and head back to the office. That's when he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, near the right side of the hall, he glimpsed something tall, dark and distinctly human-shaped. At first, he thought it was one of the shadows stretching in the dim light. But then his flashlight beam caught it. It was there, a figure standing in the shadows, cloaked in darkness. Tall, humanoid, completely still. He didn't stop moving. He didn't even glance directly at it. He kept walking faster now towards his office. His mind was racing, telling him 100 logical explanations, but none of them satisfied the gnawing sense that he was being watched. He made it back to his office, slammed the door shut, and locked it. For the rest of the night, he stayed there, sitting against the wall, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound, the creak of the metal roof, the faint hum of the machines, the occasional scuttle of a rat somewhere in the rafters. He didn't leave, didn't move, didn't even turn on the TV. He just waited for the night to end. When the first hint of light crept through the factory windows, he cautiously opened the door and looked out. The figure was gone. There were no signs of anyone else in the factory. No footprints, no sounds, nothing. He walked through the rows one more time in the daylight. Everything was exactly as it should be. Machines were in place, doors were locked, nothing disturbed. Whatever had been there the night before left no trace. That day, he called the owner of the factory and told him he wouldn't be returning. He didn't explain why, at least not fully. He didn't want to talk about it. Even to this day, he doesn't elaborate, just says, "I don't mess with that stuff." And I believe him. He never had a reason to lie. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about something in that moment that didn't make sense and made him feel completely vulnerable. Practical man, trained to stay calm and handle emergencies, who couldn't find a reasonable explanation for what he saw. That was enough for him to quit. The story stuck with me because it was real. There was nothing magical or supernatural, nothing I had to imagine. Just a man alone in a giant, empty factory at night, confronted with something that didn't fit into logic or reason. And the fact that he didn't stick around to figure it out, that he left immediately and never looked back, made it all the more believable. Sometimes the scariest things aren't creatures or phantoms. They're the moments when you realize the world doesn't always behave the way it should, and you are utterly alone to deal with it. He never worked nights in that kind of empty, silent space again. He moved on to the state police, where at least there were other people around, backup if needed, and the darkness wasn't so complete. But whenever he tells the story, he doesn't exaggerate or add drama. He just tells it like it happened. A long, empty factory, shadows that shouldn't be there, a figure that defied explanation, and a man who knew better than to stick around and find out what it was. That's the ending he chose, and the only ending that made sense for him. Even now, I can see him sitting in that small office, flashlight in hand, heart racing, staring at a shadow that shouldn't exist. And I understand why he walked away. Some things aren't meant to be confronted. Sometimes the best choice is just to leave and never look back. I remember that night clearly. It was one of those nights that seemed quiet at first, but there was this heaviness in the air that you couldn't explain. I was doing K-9 training at a local abandoned sanitarium that the state still owned. Part of it had been converted into offices years ago, but a lot of it was left untouched. The kind of place where the floors creak, paint peels from the walls, and fluorescent lights flicker if they're on at all. The building had an older section with narrow hallways and small rooms, and a newer section that looked like a standard hospital. We had been using the newer section for this training, mostly because the older part was just too unstable, and the state didn't want us wandering around there too much. That night, there were several of us there with our K-9 partners. The plan was simple: run the dogs through scenarios where they would search the building for a bad guy in a bite suit. Standard K-9 work: search, find, apprehend. But the environment made it complicated. The hospital is big, dark, and empty. And even though we were all professionals, it was the kind of place that immediately sets your nerves on edge. We keep the dogs in their patrol vehicles when they aren't training, so they're fresh and ready. And the sounds of the night, the wind in broken windows, the distant echo of a dripping pipe, make every little noise seem amplified. That night, everyone was conducting training in the basement of the newer section. The scenario involved several dogs going through rooms, hallways, and open areas, and the dogs would identify the bad guy, alert, and engage if necessary. My dog wasn't ready for that stage yet. He was still in basic obedience and alert training, so I wasn't in the basement. Instead, My head trainer and I went up to the third floor to work on some other exercises. The third floor was quieter, narrower, and felt older than the rest of the newer section. The walls were lined with long hallways, each leading to what had been patient rooms, offices, or storage areas. The central part of the floor was a nurse's station, open and square, with a few counters and a tiny office space. From the center, hallways extended in multiple directions, creating a sort of cross pattern. I positioned myself in one of the hallways, standing with my dog. The hallway stretched behind me for about 40 yards, lined with rooms on both sides, doors either shut or hanging slightly off their hinges. Ahead of me was the nurse's station. I put my dog in a sit-stay and focused on listening to my trainer. He was explaining the next exercise, showing me how to guide the dog through searching a room without using the leash, how to read subtle cues from the dog, and how to maintain control. My dog was calm, his ears twitching occasionally, eyes following me closely. Everything was normal, just standard training. Then it happened. My dog, who had been focused on me, turned his head to look down the hallway behind me. At the same time, I heard a deep, muffled male voice coming from that direction. It was almost like a low mumble, indistinct at first, but it had a tone of speech, of someone talking quietly. I immediately cut my trainer off, telling him to hold on, and I turned my head toward the voice. The moment I turned, the voice stopped. There was no pause, no echo, just nothing. The silence hit instantly. My dog's attention returned to me like nothing had happened. My heart started racing. My first thought was someone had entered the building. But that didn't make sense. The building is locked down tight. Before we even started training, we walked through the entire floor, made sure all the doors were secure, checked for anyone who could be squatting there. Even if we had missed someone, they would have heard me multiple times announcing loudly, "Police K9, come out now. Announce yourself or the dog will be sent in." No one ever responded and I would have heard them. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was my head playing tricks. Maybe the voice was just the echo of some distant conversation from another part of the building, though that seemed impossible. We were 4 floors away from the basement where everyone else was training. The walls are thick and the sound doesn't travel that far. The floors are concrete, the ceiling's high, it just didn't fit. Despite trying to focus on the training, I couldn't shake the feeling. My dog stayed in position, perfectly calm, but his ears were slightly forward, alert. He doesn't react to small noises, just the ones that are worth noticing, and this definitely caught his attention. After the training ended, I decided to check the floor. I walked down the hallway behind me slowly, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every door I passed was empty. The rooms were all bare, except for old furniture left behind years ago. There was nothing. No person, no sound. Nothing that could explain what I had heard. I even checked the stairwells and small maintenance rooms, all locked or empty. There was no one. The rest of the team finished training and came up to check on us. I didn't mention it right away, just tried to keep my composure. We packed up, walked through the building once more, and locked everything down. The voice never came back. The building was empty. I thought about it on the drive home. Maybe it was just an anomaly. Maybe someone had been outside the building, and the sound somehow carried inside in a way that seemed like it was from down the hallway. But everything was locked. There are fences, gates, security systems. Everything is secured. And my dog reacting like that, it wasn't normal. He's trained to notice people, strangers, anything unusual. He didn't misread the situation. By the time I got home, I was still shaken, but I tried to brush it off. The next day, I returned to the building to do more training. Everything was normal, nothing unusual happened. We trained through the day, ran multiple exercises, and the building felt completely empty. Still, that night I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the voice had sounded, so close and real, and the way my dog had reacted. It was as if someone had been standing there and then vanished. I never figured out what it was, and that's what bothered me the most. There was no supernatural element, no ghosts, nothing fantastical. It was a real building, a real place, and a real event. The only things I had to rely on were my own senses and my dog, and both told me something had been there. Whether it was a squatter we missed, someone on the property we didn't notice, or something else entirely, I'll never know. From that night on, I became more meticulous during training. I always checked the floors more thoroughly, made sure doors were locked, and paid closer attention to my dog's reactions. Canine work relies on trust and instincts, and that night reminded me that sometimes instincts pick up things we can't explain. It left a mark on me, a kind of cautious respect for the environment. That hospital isn't haunted in the stories people make up. It's just old, empty, and capable of holding a sound or presence that doesn't belong. That's enough to make any trained officer uneasy, even now. Months later, I can picture that hallway, long and dark, with my dog sitting perfectly still while I listened to instructions, and the faint muffled voice that disappeared the moment I turned my head. It's a reminder that sometimes in a quiet building like that, things can happen that don't make sense, but they're still real, and they're still enough to make your skin crawl. The house sat on a quiet street, deceptively ordinary. The kind of place you'd walk by without a second thought. But anyone who had been on the force long enough could tell there was something off about it. A single-story faded white, with peeling paint and a porch that had partially caved in on one side. 2 windows were crudely patched with cardboard, and the lawn was half dead, yellowing, patchy. On the surface, it looked like just another rundown house. But the people who lived, or more accurately, hid inside, had a reputation. Even before stepping out of the van, I could smell it, chemicals, sharp, acrid, the sort of smell that clings to your clothes, bites at your throat, curls into your lungs. There was a burnt, almost sweet tang underneath, probably the residue of meth cooking or something else I didn't want to imagine. It hit you in a way that made your stomach tighten, made your pulse quicken before the body even realized what was about to happen. It was still dark outside, barely 5 in the morning. Streetlights spilled dim, orange light over the cracked asphalt, their glow flickering over potholes in the van. The neighborhood was silent, almost too silent. You could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, a dog barking in the distance, and the occasional car passing far away. Inside the van, the air was tense, thick with anticipation. We'd been sitting there for 15 minutes, checking our gear, running the plan in our heads over and over. No knock warrant, known felon inside, probably armed, definitely dangerous. Adrenaline has a strange way of creeping in early. Your body seems calm, composed, but your mind races in ways that feel almost unnatural. I ran through the steps again and again, quietly. First officer through secures the first suspect. Second officer secures the next. Third moves toward the kitchen. I am fourth. Muscle memory takes over. There's no time for thought. Every movement is drilled, ingrained. My vest felt tighter than usual, and the radio wire against my neck itched incessantly. I adjusted it twice, not because it helped, but because I had to move, had to do something with my hands to quiet the tension coiling in me. Around me, everyone else was silent. The occasional click of Velcro, a shuffle of boots, the faint static from a radio. The only audible movements in the van. Then the signal came. Sharp, almost imperceptible, and suddenly everything switched from waiting to action. 4 of us stacked tight against the door, 2 covering angles outside. The door itself was laughably flimsy. Old wood, cracked frame, a deadbolt that probably hadn't worked properly in years. The breacher rammed it once, nothing, twice. Then it gave way with a sound that bounced down the empty street and echoed in my chest. And suddenly the world blurred. First officer swept left, moving fast, hands ready, and secured the closest suspect. Second followed, the motions precise, efficient. Third officer veered toward the kitchen, eyes sharp, movements deliberate. And I, fourth, dived in. The air hit me like a physical force. Thick, heavy, sour. The smoke and chemical tang was overwhelming, clinging to the throat and eyes. The living room was small, cluttered with piles of clothes, old fast food wrappers, empty bottles. The walls were yellowed from decades of cigarette smoke. That sharp, unmistakable chemical bite of meth lingered everywhere. Before I could even fully process the room, My suspect bolted. A skinny guy in a torn gray hoodie shot down the hallway like a rabbit. I went after him, boots pounding the wooden floor, muscles tense, senses screaming. The hallway was narrow, barely wide enough to swing my arms without touching the walls. Doors lined both sides, some closed, some half open, revealing glimpses of chaos. Piles of clothes, trash, shadows. He slammed the last door on the right with such force the frame shuddered. I didn't hesitate. Couldn't. The door cracked under my push. Inside, a small bedroom, suffocating, filled with debris and junk. A mattress on the floor with a dirty, grimy blanket. He was half crawled under the bed. I lunged, knee hitting the floor, one hand on the back of his neck. His arms stretched under the bed, straining for something. The sound of his breathing was almost deafening. Fast, shallow, ragged. Sweat slicked his forehead. I twisted his arm behind him, pressing him flat, slapping cuffs into place. He went quiet once secured, and yet that hand under the bed nagged at me. He wasn't just hiding, he was reaching. I walked back down the hallway, adrenaline still surging. The rest of the team moved methodically, clearing rooms, securing areas. I crouched again, pushing the mattress aside with my forearm. Dust and lint swirled in the dim light. There it was. A double-barrel, sawed-off shotgun, black tape around the grip, barrels cut short, 2 slugs inside. Ready. The metal was cold under my gloves. It wasn't pointed at me, but it could have been. Seconds earlier he might have had it. Inches, fractions of a second. I replayed the hallway over and over. What if I had hesitated? What if he rolled faster? I took photos for evidence. Flash lit the tiny room in stark, harsh bursts. My hands were steady enough, but my breathing wasn't. I bagged the gun, tagged it, and walked it back to the entry point. The rest of the house blurred. Drugs, paraphernalia, cash in shoeboxes. But none of it really mattered. Not compared to that gun lying there, waiting, almost mocking. Outside, the air hit harder, sharper than before. Streetlights still flickered. Radios crackled. I sat on the van bumper, shotgun in the evidence bag beside me. Hands tingling, throat dry. One wrong move and I wouldn't have been sitting there. Someone else would be zipping up a bag from my body. The house cleared. Suspects cuffed, evidence logged, paperwork filed. Routine, but none of it stuck in my head. Just that moment. Just that gun under the bed. That night I couldn't sleep. Hallway, slammed door. His hand disappearing under the bed. Every creak outside my window made my chest tighten. Every gust of wind, every car that passed, every shadow cast by the streetlight, my heart jumped. By the second night, it hadn't faded. I had joined the force, young, eager, believing I could handle it. But some things follow you home. That wasn't just a close call. It was a reminder of how thin the line is, how fast it can end. 3 weeks later, I handed in my resignation. Not out of fear, but because some shadows never fade. I boxed up my uniform, turned in my gear, and walked out with the same boots I'd worn into that house. That shotgun under the bed stayed with me, a shadow I could never shake. Even now I think about it. Inches a second, the tilt of fate. Walking away was right. That night didn't just end a shift, it ended a career. And it reminded me how fragile everything really is, even when you think you're in control. I was military police at the time, still pretty new to the job, but already familiar with how nights could turn from calm to chaos in a matter of seconds. It was just after sunset, that weird gray time when the sky isn't completely dark yet, but the floodlights around the base start to click on. I had just clocked in, walked out to the patrol lot, and was checking over my unit. I always did it the same way. A slow walk around the vehicle, running my hand along the body to make sure nothing was loose or damaged, checking the tires, the siren, the radio, the radar, and making sure everything was exactly where it should be before I rolled out. It was routine, quiet, and I liked that part of the shift. I'd spent a lot of nights waiting for something to happen, and most nights nothing did. But not that night. I was standing near the front bumper of my patrol car with the radar unit on the hood, calibrating it against a known distance marker. There were a few other patrol cars lined up in the lot too. It was shift change, which always had this weird stillness to it. The outgoing shift is tired and just wants to go home. The incoming shift is fresh, ready to take over. Everyone is moving but not talking much. Engines idle. Radios click. The floodlights make the black asphalt shine. I remember it clearly, because right in the middle of that calm, the radio cracked to life. Dispatch's voice came through with that sharp, serious tone that instantly changes everything in your body. They said they'd just received a call about a man with a gun walking toward the main gate. No other details, just that. A man with a gun walking toward the gate. I looked up from the hood of my patrol car, and one of my partners a few cars down looked right back at me. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. It was just that immediate silent, oh shit kind of look you give when you both know this could be real bad, real fast. That moment of quiet stretched out in my head, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. My pulse jumped. Everything around me sharpened like the edges of the night got clearer. I tossed the radar back inside, slammed the hood shut, yanked open the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine was already running, so I just dropped it into gear and hit the lights. My partner did the same. We both hauled out of that lot fast. I don't remember exactly how fast I got up to, but I know it was somewhere around 80 or 90 miles an hour. The roads on base at night were usually empty, and when that adrenaline hits, you don't feel the speed. You just focus on getting there. The siren echoed off the buildings as I flew past the motor pool and the admin offices. My hands were gripping the wheel tight, but my mind was already running through every possibility. I'd been drilled on active shooter scenarios, and Fort Hood was still fresh in everyone's mind. That was the nightmare. That or some kind of terrorist attack. Not even a year earlier, someone had tried to sneak a bomb into the base. Everyone still remembered that too. I reached the main gate fast. The floodlights there were bright, making the checkpoint look like daylight compared to the rest of the base. The soldiers posted at the gate were tense, their eyes scanning the road outside. I pulled up with my window down and leaned out, asking where the guy was. One of the gate guards didn't even say anything, just pointed down the road that led off base. It was technically still military property up to the first stoplight, but beyond that was town. I didn't wait. I gunned it down that road. That stretch was always kind of eerie at night. It was lined with trees and patchy grass, not many streetlights. The only illumination came from my headlights and the flashing reds and blues bouncing off everything. My heart was thudding hard now. I had my pistol in its holster, my vest strapped tight, the radio clipped to my shoulder. I was replaying the dispatch call in my head over and over. A man with a gun, walking toward the gate. No description beyond that. No number of people. No clear threat level. Just the worst kind of vague information you can get. And that's when your mind fills in the blanks with the worst possible outcome. I was scanning both sides of the road. Every shadow, every tree, every parked car that might hide someone. Then my spotlight hit something, a figure. A man walking along the right side of the road, heading toward the gate. His hands were at his sides. My spotlight washed over him, and that's when I saw it. A quick, sharp reflection, like light bouncing off metal. For a second, it was exactly what my brain was primed to see. A gun. The reflection off what looked like something in his right hand. I slammed on the brakes hard. The car jerked to a stop, tires screeching on the asphalt. I threw it into park, flung the door open, and stepped out. My adrenaline was spiking so fast my vision tunneled a little. I drew my pistol, extended my arms, and locked onto him. My voice was loud without me even meaning it to be. I was commanding him to show his hands, step away, freeze. Every muscle in my body was tight. I remember the sound of my own breathing in my ears, short and fast, the cold air hitting my face and the spotlight bleaching out every other detail around him. He didn't move at first, just froze in place. The light was on him full blast. That reflection glinted again, and for a heartbeat I was absolutely sure I was seconds away from a gunfight. That kind of moment is hard to explain to someone who hasn't been in it. Your brain is racing, but everything slows down at the same time. You feel the trigger under your finger, your shoulders lock up. You're hyper-aware of every sound. In my head, I was already running through what happens when the first shot goes off, where I'm positioned, how far my partner is behind me, how much time it would take for backup to arrive. All of it in a flash. My partner pulled up behind me seconds later, lights flashing. I didn't even look back. I heard his door slam, then his boots hitting the pavement as he got out and came up on my right side. My pulse was hammering so loud it felt like it was in my throat. The guy slowly lifted his hands into the air, and that's when I finally saw it clearly. It wasn't a gun at all. It was a thermos. A plain metal thermos that had just caught the light the wrong way. I kept him at gunpoint anyway, until my partner moved in and patted him down. Cold night air, crunch of gravel under boots, my own breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. No weapons, no threat, just a man walking down the road with a thermos. The dispatch call had come from someone driving by who'd seen the reflection and panicked. A simple mistake that for a few minutes felt like it could have ended in a shooting. The adrenaline doesn't just turn off. Even after it's over, your body is still on high alert. My hands were shaking slightly. My shoulders were tight. My mouth was dry. That kind of thing doesn't just disappear when you realize it's a false alarm. My partner holstered his weapon and nodded at me. The man looked scared out of his mind, which made sense. One minute he's walking with his coffee. The next minute he's got multiple patrol cars screaming toward him and guns pointed at his chest. The temperature had dropped low that night. The kind of cold that seeps through your gloves and sticks to your face. I had paperwork to do on the encounter, and I didn't want him freezing out there while I filled everything out. So I told him to sit in the passenger seat of my unit while I ran his information. He didn't resist. He was quiet. He told us he had a DUI on record, and that's why he was walking instead of driving. He worked as a janitor at one of the schools on base and was just heading home after a late shift. Nothing more. Just a guy who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I filled out the report slowly. Every box, every detail. Call time, location, description of the object, actions taken, outcome. The heater in the car was blowing warm air, and the sound of it filled the silence. My hands had finally stopped shaking. I could still feel the weight of the pistol on my hip, and the ghost of how it felt to have it drawn and ready. I kept thinking about how close I had been to pulling the trigger. All it would have taken was one sudden move on his part. One misunderstanding, 1 second of bad judgment, and the entire night would have ended differently. Careers destroyed, a life lost. Everything changed. When I finally let him go, he walked away down the same road, the thermos in his hand again, just a regular guy disappearing into the cold dark. My partner and I stayed parked there for a few minutes after, lights still flashing, just letting the adrenaline burn out of our systems. The base was quiet again. The night had gone back to stillness like nothing had happened, but inside, it didn't feel the same. I drove back toward the gate slow this time, no lights, no siren, just the hum of the engine and the sound of my boots squeaking when I stepped out later. The radio was quiet. The lot was quiet. It wasn't the kind of call that makes headlines. Nobody would ever talk about it outside the shift. But for me, it was one of those moments that sticks. Because it's not the big calls that get under your skin the most. It's the ones that almost turn into something worse. The split seconds where you realize how thin the line is between routine and tragedy. I signed back in at the station and finished the last of the paperwork. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh after being outside in the dark. I could still see that flash of reflection in my head. The way it had looked so much like a weapon. I could still feel the way my chest tightened when I stepped out with my gun drawn. That's the thing about that kind of work. It's not just the dangerous moments that stay with you. It's the close calls, the almosts. Later that night when the radio was quiet again, I sat in the patrol car with the window cracked, cold air moving in, and thought about how easy it is for something simple to spiral out of control. I didn't feel proud or relieved exactly, just clear. It reminded me why every second matters in this job. Why you can't afford to be careless. Why those silent looks before everything happens matter more than words. The man with the thermos went home. I went back on patrol. The gate lights stayed bright. The night didn't care what almost happened. But I did. And I still remember that reflection every time I pull someone over in the dark.